Hello, in this video I want to continue the conversation that we've been having about settler colonialism and the worker strike. I definitely think this has been an interesting series because on the last couple of videos we got to talk a lot of the questions of like what this criticism looks like as a negative strategy versus policy teams and how policy teams are responding to it, which I definitely think is an important conversation to set up a lot of this stuff that we'll be talking about next, which is really a question of how can we think about like this criticism as central to the affirmative and what it looks like as an affirmative argument. I definitely think that in order to kind of get into this video, you're definitely going to need to at least turn into the intro to the settler colonialism and worker strike to get what I'm thinking are some of the key arguments that can be made in the context of like what an affirmative would look like on this resolution and the various ways in which you can kind of like position different questions for asking like what this looks like on the affirmative and negative, whether you're trying to figure out if you should be looking to answer it or if you're trying to figure out how you can read the strategy to make it more precise. In the videos that I'm going to kind of be doing up next, I want to talk a little bit more about just like what I think the best possible forms of this type of argument on the affirmative, considering like how the resolution is written, and I think like the various kind of tricky things I think teams really need to be thinking about in order to make the affirmative argument really solid. And then I really want to talk about the ways in which you really need to be prepared against various types of arguments, such as case arguments, framework arguments, T arguments, criticisms, counterplans, and disads, all of which I think are things that will show up in the base that you have if you're going to read this argument on the affirmative. So I definitely think that you need to be ready in order to really kind of like get all the juice out of this argument when you're reading it. Just to kind of start this video, I think that I really want to start at just talking about what I think the kind of like best forms of these affirmatives really look like. I think if you think about the resolution as it's kind of written, that moral state ought to kind of like recognize the worker strike. I think that a lot of the ways in which you can kind of like think about how you make a criticism really courts this resolution is how can you take a lot of the ways that are kind of like comfortable reading settler colonialism already, that really kind of couch themselves in being able to argue about the kind of history of the U.S. domestically and the ways in which various forms of domesticized forms of colonial violence basically create scenes in which settler colonialism is continually something that becomes like erased throughout history, and genocide becomes something that is like apparent in the way in which like various forms of political institutions form themselves. I feel like a lot of the arguments that you want to start making are about just theoretically why we're already at a kind of like point in time because of the historical conjunction that happens that happens as a result of settler colonialism, along with various other forms of dispossession, that makes it so that the kind of like functioning of the sovereign within that kind of like territory of understanding is one in which the sovereign like has to be able to manage forms of resistance, quell resistance, and feed itself in order to like create its like own model of self-preservation. I feel like a lot of the arguments that need to be kind of like really seeped in a lot of these criticisms are how can you make arguments about why the kind of like sovereign at its like theoretical level is kind of like broken to a point where there isn't really a way to repair the damage that it kind of like does in terms of being able to really consider like being able to like recognize how to correct itself, because I think a lot of the arguments that are kind of like best made from the lens of settler colonialism and those that are kind of like studying the effects of colonialism are about why things like sovereignty in the first place are created under the terms of like Eurocentrism, are created under the terms of conquest, and those kind of like ideas about what the sovereign does as a capacity is not something that is like universal to like everyone's historical existence of all time, right? It is something that is built into a particular logic of like being able to like further expand its control of territory in order to like manage various types of like human subjects. And so I feel like being able to make these kind of like core criticisms of why the sovereign at like a central kind of like idea has to be parasitic to the notion of being able to like, you know, do decolonial work or be part of like what a decolonial ethic could look like make a lot of sense at kind of like a theoretical thesis level for how you should be kind of like critiquing the center kind of portion of the resolution, and like why at any capacity the kind of like state's capacity to then recognize various movements of resistance, how that can only participate in the active forgetting and erasure of settler colonialism and its ability to kind of like haunt the way in which these movements are able to arise out of that conquest in various forms of violence. I think that the kind of like place in which you can kind of like think about how this starts looking methodologically, I definitely think there are a lot of options open. I feel like there's a lot of like archival questions that can be done, because I feel like if the question is like what could the state be at a theoretical level, it really becomes a like kind of like archival question, or I think at some basis of just like what is the way in which we can study and think about the state's theoretical value. And I feel like at that kind of like level there are a lot of arguments to make about like why just questions of how we study and think about like ways of charting the state's possibilities as like important to like how we're able to continually refuse and find constitutive outsides to that could be really interesting places to start off, whether that's through just like refusal, whether that's through like ontology sociology, whether that's to just a decolonial kind of like archival like study of the resolution, etc. All of which I think could be important. I definitely also think that there are a lot of arguments to be made about various like alternative forms to like what the state has to offer in terms of like what governance could be, and why those alternative forms of like doing various forms of like mutual aid or community organizing that exists outside of the paradigm of like a central kind of like state-based organizing institution, and the way in which that can like differentially take up the moniker of like what the worker strike could accomplish and look like outside of that kind of like necessary relationship to the state, could also be an interesting place to really develop a lot of arguments. I think that when you transition to what some of this looks like in the context of what you should be thinking about at like a framework T level, a lot of the stuff that I think is really important is how can you really touch every portion of the topic so that the way that it's like worded doesn't become something that's used in order to kind of like force your arguments into like this small space where you're not really able to win a lot of like wiggle room out of just like generally what people are kind of like considering your focus to be in terms of like whether or not you're having to center yourself around just like the history of the like US or whatever country. And I think that being able to also make arguments about the ways in which you can kind of position the value of like why thinking about the state and not disconnecting it from histories of settler colonialism and not the eruption of just the US but the world's kind of like necessary relationship to that dispossession, because the way in which it fuels, you know, an entire or like, you know, aids in fueling an entire kind of like world market that we still exist and live in now. Like there is no state that can kind of be formed outside of its reach because of the various ways in which that model of like what sovereignty looked like has expanded itself into various types of international organizations, and it has expanded itself into like the ability of those like same kind of like colonial states to become large managers of other nations, etc., and make arguments about why this kind of like expansive question to why you can't really disconnect its theoretical value from also being able to do a study of the way in which it is looked like in other places, I think would be a really interesting way for you to be able to make arguments about why the kind of like worker strike and its relationship to like the sovereign's capacity to like be able to like recognize movements without like doing forms of like violent self-preservation is a question that can like really only be answered like through the affirmative kind of way of thinking about and studying resolution as a setup for a lot of the stuff that we'll kind of be talking about in the next video and stuff throughout the series. So hopefully this video has been really helpful, and hopefully you'll keep tuning into more videos I'll be doing, and yeah, thanks as always.